For those of you joining, I want to say welcome to the NZAG webinar. I can see we're up to 30. When the counting stops, we'll probably go ahead. I've been very good in managing to make my own screen background, which reminds us all about our upcoming NZAG conference. We're up to 38. And we're just on 12:01. We'll potentially wait another few seconds to see if others are joining right now. And then we'll start. It's not a bad day here in Auckland. We've got some bad weather planned. I'm expecting you're all joining from all over New Zealand, which is usual. Bad weather seems to be going around. Okay, well, I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Judy Blakey, to begin the session with a karakia. Go ahead, Judy.
Mauri oho, mauri tū, mauri ora, kia tātou, homie, huie, tākie.
Kia ora. Thank you, Judy. That sets us off well. So welcome to the NZAG webinar, which is about AI and older people, artificial intelligence. My introduction to AI was, of course, through Chat GPT, which it's interesting. One of the presenters used Chat GPT to make her a short bio, so everybody's using it. My daughter used it the other day to look up my knee MRI and give advice. I'm not taking that to the surgeon. So we're very fortunate to have 3 speakers today. But just before we do that, I want to remind everybody my backdrop is Rethinking Aging, which is the NZAG conference in September. There is a call for abstracts out right now. The closing date is the end of next week, the 26th. Please think about coming along. Please put in your ideas for a presentation, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. I know there will be sessions about AI at the conference as well. It seems to be a very important, good crowd grabber. We are in a webinar format today, so please, when you have questions, and I expect you will, put your questions in the Q&A, the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to have a direct question, please raise your hand. There should also be a place there to raise your hand, and our wonderful administration, Karine, will let you in to ask those questions. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Kevin Ross is the CEO of Precision Driven Health, an award-winning research partnership applying data science to enable precision health. PDH establishes collaborations between clinicians, data scientists, and technology companies applying the latest advances in data analysis to generate health benefits through software tools. He's also product director at Analytics and Intelligence for Orion Health, a New Zealand-owned global healthcare platform, managing over 100 million, 100 million patients worldwide. He's a fellow of the Health Informatics New Zealand and chair of the advisory board for NAOI, the Institute of Natural, Artificial and Organizational Intelligence. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin now to give us his presentation about fundamentals of AI possibilities and risks. Thanks, Kevin.
Kia ora, and thank you, Nari. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts here. So we've got a really interesting group of presentations. I think, as we discussed just beforehand, we'll give a little bit of a presentation each as a panel, and then we'll take questions primarily at the end. So what I'm going to do is really rush through an introduction to artificial intelligence. And what I thought we'd do is start clearly with sort of the definition of what are we talking about here. Because artificial intelligence is really a spectrum of capability, and we talk about it in a lot of different contexts, and I want to be sort of permissive in the definition here that, you know, we're talking about using computers to help. Ultimately, it's doing things that would normally require human intelligence. And that becomes sort of the underlying definition that gets used in most places. We have lots of sort of benefits in cases where artificial intelligence is potentially very useful. There's lots of examples where artificial intelligence is already being used, and we sort of rely on, sometimes knowingly, often unknowingly. And again, because of that broad spectrum, from sort of the ability to do calculations faster than our minds can go, through to the ability to create things that are new. This has a wide variety of implications for society, both at an individual and a cultural level. So you'll have people much more qualified than me afterwards to talk about some of the implications specifically. But what I thought I'd do was a little bit of an intro to some of the examples of where, particularly in the health field, because that's where I specialize, where artificial intelligence is starting to play an important role. So I'm going to do this sort of a way too fast to take in all the details, so don't worry if you miss pieces along the way. One of the primary areas that is difficult in health is managing data, and this can be image data or text data, if you like. There are lots of applications out there today that really are specializing in just the ability to manage our medical data. And that can start with pretty basic software management to, interpreting the data in certain ways. And I'll talk about some of the examples of interpretation that sort of come from that. One of the interpretations is diagnosis. So obviously in health, this is one of the most critical things that we rely on clinicians to do, is to diagnose that we think based on this information, based on what we know about medical knowledge and what we know about this patient in front of us, this is what we think the condition is. And you'll notice the way I phrase that is actually an information gathering, and then a pattern matching, and then this is probably, or this is what we think kind of phrase, because that's actually what clinicians do. They pattern match. They take what they know about you as a patient, or me as a patient. They take what they know about medical knowledge and they match those things together, and then they give a probabilistic, this is probably the answer. It turns out a lot of the stages of that thought process, computers are really good at. Computers are really good at processing large volumes of information, really good at pattern matching. And those are two things that we can kind of bring together and think of that diagnosis process being something that computers can potentially be very helpful for. Now, there's all sorts of questions that leads to in terms of where do you draw the line and actually rely on something that we call artificial intelligence to make a diagnosis. But fundamentally, the core capabilities along the way are things that computers are good at, and therefore artificial intelligence is potentially a valuable technology for us. One of the areas that's particularly interesting is drug discovery, or medical research more generally, but particularly drug discovery, because today you see volumes of data that we've never really imagined before, and complexity of that. And think of that in terms of genome sequencing as an example, where you just have mind-blowing amounts of data involved, and we want to do some statistical analysis on that. If we were doing that relatively manually as humans, it would take years and years and years to do what we now can do in seconds. And that played out through some of the development of things like vaccines and that sort of thing, that some of the underlying technology that's relied on in there is really high-speed computing. Now, some people would argue that high-speed computing itself isn't necessarily artificial intelligence. I sort of, like I say, I'm drawing a broad spectrum here, where essentially where we're asking a computer to help us with something that it can do better than us. It's adding intelligence. It's not necessarily doing something beyond what we've asked it to do, which is where you sort of get into more interesting kind of dilemmas in terms of artificial intelligence, but where we have sort of control of that. What's the question, and here's the information you can use to answer it. I would argue that's still at least a stage along the artificial intelligence spectrum. Early detection is an obvious area that we're starting to experience, because we're all wearing all sorts of devices or carrying phones in our pockets, or these sorts of things that ultimately lead to sort of a monitoring capability that we didn't have before. And again, that's all about the amount of data that's being captured, but also the ability to process that data, match it against patterns that we understand, and then put that information in a way that we can understand. That leads more broadly to the area that we'd call clinical decision making. And again, you've got lots of different places where that plays out, but essentially this is where you actually start to say, I'm going to allow the computer to make that decision. And we'd often argue that we never do that, that we always put a human in the loop and a clinician in the loop. But actually, if you take the broader definition here, we let computers do calculations. We wouldn't imagine that we could possibly do better hand calculations than a computer, and we would always rely on the calculator to do better than us. And that pretty quickly leads into there's certain things that we think are safe because we can put a box around it and we can be confident that we know, given these inputs, we'll get outputs that are reliable. So decision making, again, is a spectrum here. There are decisions that are really quite what we'd call a decision tree, where there's if this happens, then I should do that. If something else happens, you should do that. There's those sorts of decisions. And ultimately, they sort of lead into more probabilistic decisions, which is, this is the most likely best next action given the information we know. And again, we are going to see more and more computational power applied to those sorts of areas. And again, that real-time workflow decision-making is something that we're just gradually building trust in computers to be able to do things. Now, there's all sorts of implications about what happens if we therefore start automating things that happen, and I'm sure Daniel and Amanda will touch on some of those as well. One of the areas that we're seeing quite a lot of interest in is what we'd call medical assistants or AI assistants, and often those are, I think of it as a third person in the room. So if you have a clinician and a consumer or a patient having a conversation, then an AI assistant can play a really important role of actually listening into that conversation and doing things like writing things down for you so you don't have to write it yourself. Maybe putting that into a form that leads to a prescription. So the clinician can spend more time having a conversation, looking you in the eye and having this interaction person to person, while the AI is helping with the things that nobody likes doing, which is data entry essentially into computer systems. And again, so some of those stages that are quite laborious from an administrative perspective, the AI assistant can really help. But as soon as you can get an AI assistant to do things like listen and document, you can then imagine that it might do other things like suggest. Did you think about this? Have you asked? Normally, when there's that diagnosis, we would ask this question. Have you thought of asking that question? Again, it can add a sort of an assistant over the shoulder, if you like, that's giving you a little bit of direction of what you might do. And then the ultimate question is, do you then, at what stage do you not even need the clinician in the room so that you can have the conversation with that AI assistant without needing the clinician involved in that process? Robotic surgery is kind of an area that's taken quite a lot of advance in the last decade or two. And again, this is really just recognizing that computers potentially can do motor control in ways that our human limitations might come up short, and there are situations where assistance within the surgical kind of context could be safer with technology. Again, lots of risks of knowing when we're actually willing to trust the decision-making side of that, but the actual physical piece of it is reasonably measurable in terms of saying these are the sorts of things that we're really confident, and even things like drug dosage calculations and automating the sort of the monitoring piece of surgery is really important there. I thought if we're 2 minutes, it's probably worth pulling up Chat GPT, because I know it hasn't been mentioned yet within my talk, but it's going to come up no doubt in the questions. So obviously text is a big part of our lives, and in health in particular, there's lots of information that gets stored within free text documents. They're typically really hard to get information out of. So even things like searching your medical record can be quite confusing. But beyond that, I imagine many people who are listening in have already played with Chat GPT, but I thought it would be at least instructive for us to pull up what Chat GPT is actually like, so that people have sort of seen what we're talking about. So Chat GPT is a technology that's been worked on for years and years, but has been exposed to the public within the last really 6 months. And it's suddenly given people a bit of a reality check on what's possible. So I'm logged into a freely available open Chat GPT screen here. Hopefully you can still see the right screen. Sometimes they move around. And if I type something like, what should older people know about AI? Then Chat GPT on the spot will generate some information. And again, older people exploring AI, several important things you should know, understanding practical implications. They could have written my my talk outline, or perhaps they did actually. You could go through lots of this and they say, well, I don't quite understand that. Explain that to a team. That language was too complicated for me. So actually, I would like the same thing explained in a way that I can understand. And so you're seeing similar things here. And what's happening here is that it's generating information that's kind of the way that I've asked for it, based on the questions that I'm giving and based on its knowledge in the background. And then you can go through all sorts of things. You know, should I work? Privacy, and again, it's going to go into answers there. So it's very interactive, comes up with things really quickly, and so you can imagine why educators are worried. You know, I could write me an essay on Chat GPT, and it will write a pretty good essay for me. And so there's all sorts of things that are suddenly possible in that context. Now, what I just want to sort of reflect on, just as a basic understanding, just didn't need to go to the start of the presentation, is what is ChatGPT actually doing there? What's it actually good at? So what it's really doing is what's called a probabilistic text generation. It's basically saying, when I put these words together, people are happy with the outcomes. So you ask a question and have an interaction, it's obviously trained by reading lots of different things. It's not worried about the truth of those outcomes per se. It's worried about whether or not the text that it generates is pleasing to the audience. And in general, things that are true should be pleasing, but that is not always the case. And there's all sorts of interesting implications there. But, you know, you saw my example of, you know, explain that to a 10-year-old. It's got amazing power for saying, actually, let's stop using vocabulary that doesn't work. Or I could have done translate this to Toreo and see what would come out. And there are all sorts of things you can think about in terms of actually the way that things are described. And I think that's the power of this, is around understanding the way to convey information, much more than relying on the facts or the supposed information that the Chat GPT or other large language model is actually trying to explain. Because again, it's not actually aiming for the truth, it's aiming for a pleasing outcome. And a pleasing outcome, you know, as we've seen in all sorts of cases, people get taken in by things that are not true because it's compelling, and that's easily possible through something like Chat GPT, and it will be sort of training on, you know, others who have communicated in similar ways. Anyway, that's my introduction to artificial intelligence. I've got plenty of other things we can get into in the question and answer session. There's lots of other things going on in this space, but hopefully that gives you a flavour for where we are and what the next set of questions in society might be as a result.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Remember to put your questions into the Q&A. We've got one in there already, so I know it's working. We'll take them at the end. So that was a great introduction, and I have to say that ChatGPT is causing lots of trouble in universities now, as if you didn't already know. Next speaker, Dr. Daniel Wlson, has a PhD in philosophy and a master's in health science from Waipapa Taumata Rau, which is the University of Auckland. He's worked in the software industry, particularly, and teaches in the School of Computer Science, particularly interested in policies and strategies and raising awareness about equitable AI, predominantly from a Māori perspective. And Daniel is involved in a lot of research in this area and will give us a perspective on the Māori lens of the ethical implications of AI for older people. Thanks, Daniel.
Tēnā koe Nairi. Thank you for inviting me, and Judy as well, and tēnā koutou. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so I just want to start with a whakatauaki, because you know the theme for this session was who's afraid of the big bad wolf. Just thinking of something comparable from a Māori perspective is the notion of Taniwha, which can have beneficial, positive functions, can be sort of caring, provide support for groups, but also a kind of a flip side of something that's quite dangerous for people. And here is a quote from Aperahama Taonui. He Taniwha kei te haere mai ona niho he hiriwa he koura ko tōna kai he whenua. Kaua e mataku I te hiriwa me te koura, engari kaua e tukua I te hiriwa me te koura hei ātuatanga mau. So there's a taniwha on its way with teeth of silver and gold. Do not fear the teeth of silver and gold. Just do not allow it to become your god. So it's just, you know, there are promises, there are potential pitfalls. If we're aware of the pitfalls, we can approach this with eyes wide open, okay? In some ways, you know, it's coming for us whether we're ready or not. So I kind of tend to take a critical lens, but I don't want that to be the primary focus. You know, there are pluses and minuses. So I just want to talk about, you know, aging populations, and the Māori population structure is different to non-Māori, predominantly Pākehā in this list. So this is the health service utilisation numbers. So you can see that over the ages of 60, there's quite a smaller percentage of Māori fall into this group compared to non-Māori population. And some of that is because, you know, there are high birth rates, but also some of it is due to, you know, lower life expectancy. So here's Stats NZ. So for me, I'm doing well if I get past 73.4 years, whereas by comparison, non-Māori males are expected to live to 80.9 years. So there are health disparities between Māori and non-Māori populations. Here is a risk model called NZ Risk. There's a link here to this website, but it's trained on historical data about mortality rates post-surgery for different profiles. So it's trained on, I don't know how many thousands of historical records. And here we've got a profile for a particular person, male, ASA level 3, acute cancer present. It's going for a lung transplantation. So here's the risk profile for dying within, say, I think 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. For a European Pākehā age 65. And if we take these same parameters but change it to a Māori aged 55, you get exactly the same risk profile, right? So Māori populations are effectively got something like a 10-year penalty, you know, risk penalty when it comes to these mortality rates. So it's just indicating that, you know, that there are differences between some populations, Māori and non-Māori, and these have impacts. Okay, so I'm involved in a project that's funded by the Health Research Council about using routinely collected health data for predicting dementia. And most of what we've been doing so far is doing surveys about how comfortable are you with data use. And I just want to share a couple of things that have come out of this. This is not from this particular project, this is an earlier one. Another point of difference is that even though, you know, Māori are dying younger, the onset of conditions like dementia occurs younger as well. So it's not that, you know, that dementia onsets for every group at a particular age. So here we have one paper saying that Māori patients were 8.5 years younger on average than New Zealand Europeans at first presentation of dementia. So here are some of the outcomes from the survey. Oh, actually, no, this is, again, sorry, a different paper. The next slide will be the survey. So this is looking at different conceptions around mate wareware. So this is from Makarena Dudley's work. She was interviewing hundreds of Māori about their understanding of dementia and, you know, how they relate what consider to be protective factors, for instance. And here are a list of some of the results here. So it was considered that engagement in cultural activities were a protective factor. So, engaging in the community, being able to perform duties on marae, for instance, kept people engaged socially, culturally. Being able to listen to Te Reo Māori for those who find that if they're native speakers, their first language is something comforting to hear. And there was a lot that was focused on the spiritual aspect of health that contributed to well-being. And also there were differences in the use of residential care as well, compared to New Zealand European cohorts. So they were more likely to have affected whānau members stay within the household and adjust the household to work with that family member rather than use residential care. So a lot of the routine health data that's collected is clinical in nature, but a lot of these aspects kind of fall out of it, right? So a focus on whānau health rather than individual health, focus on spiritual and social aspects rather than straightforwardly, clinical, dietary aspects, things like this. So what does AI for healthcare look like in this situation? When you've got models that are developed for one population, are they really catering for aspirations for Māori? So that's just thrown out there as a question. And here we have the results of the survey. So there were some that there may be 80% of people were happy with the use of de-identified health data for creating applications that will help others in the community. That's the general gist, but there were a number of concerns that were raised in free text responses. So things about being able to ensure that the information is correct, things like ensuring privacy and confidentiality with respect to their data, that there's always humans in the loop, that data doesn't get sold to other companies, for instance. So these were examples. And then there were Māori participants in the survey who were more likely to raise these issues around consent to use of data. So they might have a preference for their whānau members to benefit from the use of the data, as well as feedback about the use of the data, how it was used in these AI systems. And also concerns about the use of data after death. So these kind of map to other concerns or about the conceptions of data as an extension of the person. And so we're seeing concerns that might arise in things like organ donation or blood donation, these cultural concerns, also coming up in data issues. So we're going to explore that a bit more. We're going to run a wānanga to explore these issues a bit further. I'm not sure how many minutes I've got here or whether I've chewed it up, but there were a couple of examples of the use of AI in healthcare. One is Orbiter Assist, that is intended to sit alongside, the patient nurse call button. But what it's intended to do is sit there listening and respond to commands so that it would trigger if somebody needs support, the person who's coming would already know what it's about and be prepared. But then there are some familiar considerations around privacy. How's the data used? Is this providing an environment that enables fewer person-to-person interactions? These kinds of things. But also, if you've got Te Reo Māori speakers, is there support for that? There's one question. And similarly with AI companions, similar issues here. And again, even that issue of is it enabling an environment for fewer social interactions? If you've got, somebody who you would otherwise, you'd visit more regularly, but you think they're okay with their assistant for the moment because life is busy, is this technology enabling that kind of further social isolation? And we don't really know the effects of the illusion of empathy and illusion on real social connection. Just one final comment before I leave. I was looking at this report there's a World Health Organization report on ageism and artificial intelligence for health. And it was interesting because here are the various recommendations that were put forward. And this is very similar to recommendations that we put forward for supporting Māori perspectives in trust and automated decision making a couple of years ago. Things like ensuring that you have got a diverse group involved in the design of what the question is, the design of the technology, and so forth. And funding further research, of course, robust ethics processes and governance frameworks that are apt and inclusive. So I thought that was quite fascinating. It really just shows that the same sort of general recommendations calling for a greater diversity of who's involved in the creation of these systems. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel. That was fabulous. Great examples there. Now, please do put your questions in the Q&A icon. The Q&A icon is working well. Our third speaker today, who used Chat GPT to put together her bio, is Dr. Amanda Williamson, PhD from the Institute of Work Psychology in the UK, where she used AI to detect changes in well-being based on speech patterns. She served as a senior lecturer in innovation and strategy at the University of Waikato, and now currently is the manager at Deloitte, where she translates technological advancements into practical solutions. And her role in Deloitte involves leading AI and data projects. And she's going to talk to us about some examples of how AI can be useful for older people. Thanks very much, Amanda. Can anybody else hear Amanda? We can't hear you, Amanda. I don't know why. This is very unusual in such a technologically advanced group to have this problem. Amanda, is that you?
Yes, that's me. Hopefully that's
well done. Thank you very much.
Always have a backup option. That's the lesson of the day. Have something else you can plug in when these things happen. So hello. First of all, I want to thank Kate Reed, who helped me prepare these slides, and looking forward to jumping into this topic further. We've already had some really great examples given. So first of all, when we're talking about well-being and AI, what are the issues that are inflicting older people? Well, some of the big issues are chronic health problems. We know that older people tend to use the healthcare system more. And another big issue, which Dr. Daniel Wlson touched on, is this loneliness issue. Some reports suggest that anywhere from 10 to 13% of people aged over 65 experience quite a lot of loneliness on a day-to-day basis. And other research in New Zealand suggests that number could be as high as 53%. So it's a big issue. And what can we do about it? Personally, I think that one of the biggest things that AI can do is actually improve our healthcare system. This is my father here in a photo with my kids and my niece, and he is 72 years old. And one of the biggest issues that we're experiencing at the moment is that he needs to have a hip operation. He's been on the waiting list for a very, very long time. And last time he had a meeting with a doctor about it, he was left very unsure as to how long he's going to wait, what the process involves, and what life might look like outside of that. And it's really brought to my attention how much we could improve in this area when it's your family members. We've also had another family member recently go through a horrible experience with prostate cancer. And we found the power of AI ourselves just by realizing that when he got medical results back that we couldn't understand, we started feeding them into Chat GPT, despite all the ethical issues that are certainly present there. We realized that when we were waiting for those doctor's appointments, and they took so long to come, that in the meantime, we could plug that gap through using AI. So it's a topic very close to my heart. And AI, I think, as Dr. Kevin Ross touched on, it can impact so many parts of the the client journey, I guess you'd call it, through the health system. So that first one, what I was referring to talking about my father, is that patient flow. When can you expect your hospital appointment to come? And these are things that you don't see as a user of healthcare systems, but if we can inject AI here, it's incredibly powerful. So we've seen really wonderful examples in Australia of a AI system which is called a digital twin. A digital twin is a virtual world where you can plug in a whole bunch of different data sources and make it act just like a real life scenario. And so you can change different bits of data and get an outcome that can replicate the real world. And people have done this with waiting lists, and they've been able to optimize the waiting list by figuring out who's going to be working, what the likelihood of staffing issues are, and where can you put different patients to get the most out of the system. So it's really, really cool tools that there. We've had, Kevin already mentioned predictive care. Clinical coding is another area there that we're seeing really amazing contributions and technological implications. The other way that you do see it, not just in the world of health systems, but on our everyday lives, is through telemedicine. So this is not anything new, but what we are seeing is that things are getting a lot better. One of the issues that older people are experiencing is a greater need to talk to their GP. They've got more health issues than the general population on average. So how is it for people who need to talk to the GP and they have to wait 2 weeks to get an appointment? Well, this is where telemedicine is quite powerful, and particularly for people who have issues navigating the physical world as well. And I think we've all had very frustrating experiences when we've dealt with AI on the internet or on a telephone call, and you start yelling at it, let me talk to a human. But it's getting a lot better. We've got the ability to connect people with real humans by using AI systems. And then now we even have things like Chat GPT, but in a medical world. And there are some really interesting results coming out about the chatbot or the AI assistant-driven telemedicine options, that they are able to sometimes perform better than human doctors, and they can actually show or express more empathy than time constrained and pretty amazing doctors around the world. So that's a very promising area for elder health, but it also raises huge ethical concerns, as Daniel touched on before. Another thing about the telehealth that excites me a little bit is also the opportunity for multilingual questions and answers. And the next one here is predicting illnesses early. And we've touched a little bit on this, and Daniel even mentioned Alzheimer's. This is an area that is continuing to develop every day, every week. So just this week, a article came out that suggested that they were able to predict, just from how someone was talking, Alzheimer's with 75% accuracy. Personally, that scares me. But if used well, the implications are that we could predict illnesses a lot easier in a far more economical manner. I also am really impacted by the rates of bowel cancer in New Zealand and how difficult it is for people to get screened for that. We're seeing advances in AI that can allow people to swallow things that can go down their system, and we can use AI to do a far better job at monitoring that. Quite recently, I actually went for a bowel screening myself, and I had a colonoscopy. And the doctor actually said, "Oh, you work in AI. Isn't that funny? Because I'm going to use AI on you." I wasn't particularly thrilled about being a guinea pig to AI, but it was amazing to see how it was working. So as I was having my colonoscopy, they were able to see by using the AI system if there were areas that they were overlooking. So to say, "Hey, did you miss that there might be something there that you might want to consider?" And luckily I got a clean bill of health, but it was a very meaningful use of AI when it's impacting people's lives in this manner. Another thing that Daniel touched on before was this idea of healthcare assistant. So to elaborate more on this, I think a lot of us have had this experience where we're in a healthcare setting and we press the call bell and you realize this has not changed in so long and it's incredibly inefficient. It's hard for nurses because how do they know what's a higher priority or a lower priority just based on one bell? Sometimes someone just needs some water. Other times someone's in a very urgent situation. And there is a huge amount of scope here for improvement. And a few years ago, there were a whole bunch of really smart people putting together some ideas for how to solve this. And they came up with using a normal everyday consumer device, which you can talk to. Sometimes you can talk to your phone like Siri. This one is Alexa. So you say, Alexa, tell me the weather for the day. Same idea, allowed people to talk to this robot type thing and make calls to staff. So putting this in more detail. So the way that Deloitte Assist or Orbiter Assist, now as Daniel highlighted, uses is that it allows the patient to actually make a verbal request to the button. So if they can't find the button to make their call, they can actually tell the nurse what they're needing. And this means that they don't have to be by the bell, they can be anywhere in the room. The second part is that it's verbal, which makes it far more human. And then it thirdly allows the nurses to prioritize. They can put things at the top, at the bottom, and illustrate what's the most urgent need of use there. And also direct the right person to that call. Really interestingly, though, the benefits of tools like this is not always intended. And with this tool, a really nice unintended side effect was that people actually felt more connected. They were able to put on music that they wanted if they wanted to listen to Bach one day, and even in some cases use it to make a connection with others. So it's really interesting how we can use these consumer products in the health setting. And then coming to that second problem, and this will be me before I close off and then let us get to questions and answers, so please do keep popping them into the chat, is virtual companions. Loneliness is such a huge issue, and I think we're very early on our journey with what we can do here using AI. My hope is that the fundamental way that we'll be able to improve well-being and health with artificial intelligence is not actually directly by tackling loneliness. It's indirectly. It's by freeing people up so they can be human, so they can have empathetic conversations. But in saying that, there are some things out there already. For example, this is a virtual companion prototype, which ended up being replaced by a thing that looks more like a robot, which allowed people in certain groups in the Netherlands from Deloitte to be able to engage with a robot and ask it questions and to be told when it needed to take medication. So it's an interesting use case, and I think we're just at the beginning, but I do want to say that this will never be enough. We've got huge ethical concerns to overcome when it comes to personal data. And no matter how advanced we get medicine, how much we can improve our health services, ultimately, this is never going to replace the need for human connection. And these two books I absolutely love, AI Superpowers and Deep Medicine, really goes into this topic in a lot of detail around why AI will never replace it. People have in quite a lot of agreement there. So this is just a little taster. I'm sure we could all go into a very long conversation about it, but letting us have time for question and answers now, I'll close off. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Fascinating presentation. Now I'm going to ask Judy Blakey to come back to, with us too. If you could turn your camera on, Judy. Judy actually put together this webinar for the NZAG, and I think it's been a fantastic idea. We've got some really good probing questions in the lineup. I'm just going to ask the first one to Daniel. So Daniel, it's about, other than encouraging more Māori participation in data science, how can we, are we mitigating the risks of non-Māori algorithms from AI informing and or making decisions about Māori?
That's the topic of another presentation. I mean, I'm in another research project on the tikanga and technology.
That's right, yeah.
Thanks, Val. Yeah, there's a greater awareness in government organisations of Māori data sovereignty. So there are efforts by various organisations to try and address that, and data feeds into the training of these various artificial intelligence models. So there's a bit of an awareness raising exercise there. There is some funding that goes to, there are some Māori organisations who work in AI development, not necessarily in healthcare, but they are successfully partnering and getting research funding. So Te Hiku Media is one that's been quite successful when it comes to language models. I'm in a tikanga and technology project that's working with a consultancy. So there we've got Māori consultants. That's with Nicholson Consulting. And that's been quite valuable. And we're developing frameworks for thinking through questions that ought to be asked, and the assumptions that are being made at different points. But you get to this point where there's either too little detail, like high-level principles, where you expect people to know how to operationalize them, or too much bogged down in too many little questions that don't necessarily apply to everything. So having those who have a tacit understanding of the values and who can articulate when things are, don't look right, I don't think there's a replacement for that at the moment.
Thank you. And I think that answers a second question there from Lawrence, which is about the need for investment in digital infrastructure. So there is some investment in digital infrastructure and digital literacy for older Māori. Is the government taking any responsibility for this?
Well, I don't know about the digital literacy for older Māori. I mean, it makes me think of things like, we used to have pretty strong continuing education program at the university, but then there's a rethink of what education is, from being a societal good to being something that's an asset for individuals for, how much, future earning potential. And that has kind of undermined the ability of universities to connect with wider groups. So I don't know, outside of that, there might be council funded programs, but I think from the point of view of
I do know that the Office of Seniors is investing in digital literacy for older people. I don't know how far that goes for AI, though. They are very interested and invested in that. So that at least is one government funding agency. Now, for Dr. Ross there, are there any AI assistants being commercially used that will listen, take prescriptions, ask clinician follow-on questions and make diagnoses?
Yeah, so there are in pieces of that rather than one that's doing all of that. So I think, Amanda touched on some of the sort of assistance type of technology that's out there. There's certainly voice to text technology used a lot for, it started out as, when I'm doing my ward round, I want to record it and then have it automatically be typed rather than someone else have to type it. And so you've got the first stage of taking away the need to type. That's separate from, and then you've got the ability to do things like Chat GPT like technology is now being used to essentially take written text and put it into a structured form. So essentially, if you imagine a form and say, can you give me the first draft of what all the responses to these questions should be, there's tech that's doing that. Again, it's separate from the voice to text. And then the did you miss this piece, again, is very narrowly being used because it gets into this whole murky world of, is it making a clinical decision before you, what happens if it misses something? And I haven't seen end-to-end, that being relied upon and being used. I've seen it experimented just as a demonstration system, but not actually rolled out as a commercial system yet. So it's certainly coming, but I don't think there's anything that I'd describe as an end-to-end kind of full solution in that space that I'm aware of.
Amanda, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. Exactly the same. The things that are there, it's such a risky area to work in. When it comes to health, you can't put proof of concepts out on the market. So although there are lots of options and lots of things in development, there isn't a lot out there. But I am quite excited about the Alice tool that has been launched in the Netherlands, because the different features that can be built into it are really, really notable. Once we have a physical presence, and particularly for older people, then it's not hard to update the software. But yeah, not an end-to-end solution covering everything that I know of.
Not as yet.
No.
So I have dabbled in robotics with the robotics centre, and we're developing a companion for people with dementia. And you're right, it's the end-to-end nature that was very hard to hook all the way up. Rolling a couple of questions together, both about what sort of regulatory models from Jacqueline Jeffs should be used or are being used with AI in healthcare, and also the question from Lawrence, which is about AI assistants and how they're going to be used. Doesn't that mean that the older person gives personal data in there? So regulation about that personal data, isn't personal information a no-go? So I'm just going to throw that open to anybody who wants to open that. Take that question on.
I'll address the personal information piece. So I guess I challenge the assumption that it's a no-go area. A lot of us use Google Maps, and Google Maps knows where I live. It knows where I work. So I have chosen to give that information to Google so that I can put on one button for us to say, I'm going home now, which way should I go based on the traffic? And it's collecting information from lots of other people to inform me, and I'm implicitly or explicitly giving my consent for my information, in other words, my location, to be used in that context. So is it a no-go area to use personal information? It's absolutely a no-go area to use someone's personal information without their consent. What isn't clear to me is that there won't be a sufficient value seen by people that they'll give their consent. Now, that's a dangerous territory because people might give their consent unknowingly or without fully understanding. But I just sort of, I guess, I challenge the premise that it's a no-go area. Now, secondly, if you take back the question to its root, there are lots of valuable pieces of AI that don't require any personal information. So if I were to say, summarize the latest research on dementia, I'm not giving any personal information in that question. It might imply that I'm interested in dementia, but it doesn't tell you anything about it. A hugely valuable thing that it can do is, trawl through all the information that I'll never have time to look at, succinctly put it in a paragraph and help me. So that's an AI assistance to me without me giving anything explicitly for my personal information. So is personal information necessary for AI to be valuable? No. Is personal information sharing a no-go zone? I don't think so, but I think it can only be used in a very informed consent context, or should only be used in a very informed consent. And there should be a very clear value back to the people whose data is being used, both to train that model, but also to ask that question.
So who regulates that, Kevin? So I know that when I do the maps, you have to click the yes, you can know my location. So there is a privacy, there is an explicit consent there, but who regulates the necessity and the presence of that in all of the many things that we get on our phone?
Yes, so someone else might want to take some of these pieces. So in New Zealand, we're a little bit of the Wild West in this, to be honest. So we're way behind other jurisdictions in terms of having even clear principles are not there. One of my points here is we want to be careful about regulation being too narrow, because this technology moves so fast that it's out of date and gets challenged. So what we actually want are really clear principles that are uniformly understood and and adhered to, that we can then put ourselves a mirror up against what we're doing and see if that's being followed. So, you know, principles like I should be able to understand what's happening to my data. I should have control of my data. Just principles like that. We don't even have that in legislation in New Zealand, that people are owners of their own data and others are in a kaitiaki kind of guardianship role. That's not written in law, to my knowledge. There's kind of privacy laws and there's kind of implied kind of understanding, but I don't understand why we don't put some things out there and say, what are the legal implications of actually agreeing to some values as a society? We're not even at the point. I think there's been great work done in the Māori data sovereignty side to put some principles out there. Again, they're not legislated. They are principles and, you know, common understanding from a community. So long answer of no one's really clear about how you legislate, not even just who legislates and then who monitors whether or not that's being followed. But yeah, curious to hear the other comments on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, I mean, even one big issue that we find with AI is, you know, most data rules are that people have the right to be forgotten. That's one of the rules that's pretty consistent. But with AI, these models are built using a lot of data. And so do people have the right to be forgotten when we're using AI? Possibly not. So it's a very contentious issue, but we are seeing a lot of progress come out of Europe at the moment, who've just put out a proposal for how they would like to tackle the risk around AI, and they will police it quite strongly. And they're doing a tiered system where it's based on the amount of risk a certain AI system poses. Over to you, Daniel.
Kia ora. Yeah, we are. I mean, it's great to hear, Kevin, what you're talking about, how far behind we are, because there are also, I think, you know, in Europe, strong civil society groups who have strong views on things like privacy and how privacy has negatively impacted groups in the past. And, you know, this is something that's taken as a real political issue. And so that pressure can arise. But that's more of a groundswell thing that we don't have here. We don't kind of tend to avoid complaining or, you know, wanting to make a fuss. So what we've got instead is, you know, something like the government algorithm charter, which is sort of voluntary opt-in for government agencies who report the use of algorithms, who do self-assessments about whether, you know, they think there's risk. And, you know, sometimes that can be a bit iffy because, you know, I've had a look at examples where, you know, their privacy impact assessment says one thing, there's big risk here, but when they go through, you know, presenting something for the algorithm charter, actually, oh, we think it's moderate risk now. So yeah, it's not great here.
Okay, so I'm going to take Chair's prerogative and ask Judy a question. So Judy is Dr. Judy Bailey, and so she is an avid user of technology and has come up with this idea of AI for older people and how we should be actually talking about it a bit more and actually thinking about it, because it is here in a lot of the ways that we work and in a lot of things we use. So what do you think, Judy? Are you reassured by this seminar that AI will be good for older people?
Well, there are two takeaways from me, and I go back to the WHO report, which I encourage everybody to look at, because they talk about age-inclusive data collection and that. And I think what struck me is they said here that government-sponsored data hubs should ensure that data is collected appropriately, but they also talk about the fact that in some countries, there are data cooperatives that are overseeing the use of data collected. And so I thought that was interesting in terms of, you know, being able to monitor the people whose data, that it matters to them, but then also linking in with what Daniel said about education. You know, this absolutely requires ongoing education for public good. And so the challenge will be to actually get rid of the market model that's using education as a commodity, and actually recognize that, in fact, for the well-being of everybody, with this fast-moving field, we have to upskill the whole population. Yeah. So
Thank you
whether
very
I
much.
answered your question or not, I don't know, but
That's great perspective, Judy. And just the last comment from Gillian Robinson, which is very pertinent to the last part of our discussion, is that once you put information into AI and it builds its algorithm, the algorithm is there, and you can't really get that information out again. You can't withdraw the information. And just remembering that Chat GPT is built on from information from the internet up until not recently, just a few years ago, but that information has never been fact checked. So how do you know rubbish in, rubbish out, so I just think we all have to be very, very aware. So I'm going to give last comment just around to everybody before we do thanks. Daniel, in last comment.
Oh, thank you to everyone who's here. Part of some of the connections, some of the issues involved is raising awareness. So the very fact that you're wanting to think through these issues and giving me the opportunity to think through these issues for older populations is valuable.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. And again, I'd emphasize education and engage rather than be fearful and sort of read the let it be done to us. Let's engage in actually the conversation about how we want to take this forward. It's not going away, but it can be guided from here.
And Amanda.
Completely echo those comments, but I will say, if you are using a tool like Chat GPT, just know that it does say that it will take the information and help it build a better model, unless you've set it to forget you. That is something to keep in mind if you're using your personal information. So it's about using the technology, but doing it with guardrails and with our eyes wide open. Very
good comment. Okay, so I'd like to thank our panelists, Daniel Wlson, Kevin Ross and Amanda Williamson, and a special thanks to Judy Blakey for putting it together for us. And thanks to BSL for being administrators and running this webinar so well. So I'm Nairi Kirst, the Joyce Cook Chair in Ageing Well and the President of the NZAG. And I'll look forward to seeing you all at our conference. And if all of you who are listening would please join the organisation, we'd be very, very grateful. We're easy to find on the internet, and we will be very careful with your information should you care to join. So thank you very much, everybody. And signing off. Judy, final. Yes, thank you, Judy. Closing karakia. Thank you very much.
Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ao, te aroha me te maratau. Tihei Mauri ora.
Kia ora, and thank you very much, everybody.